Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Samach Vav Amud Beis, 66b of Maseches Kiddushin, starting 7 lines from the bottom of the page at the new Mishnah. And the Mishnah says as follows: Kol makom sheyesh Kiddushin ve'ein avera. Any situation, any marriage where you have Kiddushin that takes effect, and there's no avera, no transgression, meaning it's a permitted marriage. So if it's a permitted marriage and an effective Kiddushin, Havlad holich achar hazachar. The child, their status will follow the status of the father. Ve'ezozu. So what is an example of this? Zu kahenes levia v'Yisraelis. Let's say a kahenes, a woman from a Kohen family, or a woman from a Levi family, or a Yisraelis, a woman from a Yisrael family. Shenasu l'Kohen Levi v'Yisrael, and any of those three marries any three. The husband is a Kohen, the husband is a Levi, the husband is a Yisrael. So in all those situations, what will be the status of their child? The child will be whatever the father was. So, in other words, regardless of whether the mother came from a family of Kohanim, if the father is a Yisrael, the child will be a Yisrael. If the child is a Levi, if the father is a Levi, the child will be a Levi. And if the father is a Kohen, the child will be a Kohen. That is when it is a permitted marriage. B'kol makom sheyesh kiddushin v'yesh avera, anywhere where you have a kiddushin that takes effect, but it's an avera, it's a prohibited marriage. So there are certain marriages that are prohibited where kiddushin won't even take effect, but then there are some that it's prohibited, but if you try it, it works. Kiddushin works, they are in fact betrothed. So in such situations, if there's a Kiddushin that takes effect, but there's also an Avera, there's a transgression, Havlad holech achar ha-pagum. The Vlad, the child, will follow the Pagum, the one who has the, whatever disqualification is making this marriage forbidden. So ve'ezozu, what would be an example of this? Almana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hediot. One example would be, if a almana, a widow, marries a Kohen Gadol, a Kohen Gadol, a high priest is not allowed to marry a widow, or a grusha, a divorcee, or a chalutza, a woman who received chalitza, marries a Kohen Hediot, marries a regular Kohen. A regular Kohen is allowed to marry a widow, but he may not marry a divorcee. If they do get married, so our Mishnah holds it takes effect. There is an opinion that doesn't take effect, but this Mishnah holds that and this is I think the halacha, that the marriage does take effect. So in that case, the Mishnah says that the status of the child will follow the pagum, the one who has the disqualification. So in this case, it means that the child will not be able to be a Kohen, right? So he will not have the ability to serve as a Kohen. He will be what we call a halal. So that's again the description here is there's kiddushin, but there's an avera. They're not allowed to be married, but it takes effect. The child takes on the disqualified status. In the case where it's a Kohen marrying a divorcee, so then the child will not be able to have the status of a Kohen. There'll be a halal. And the other example we have here is mamzeres unesino leYisrael. A mamzeres is a woman who is the product of a forbidden sexual relationship, and that is what we call arayos, a situation where Kiddushin would not have taken effect. The product of such a union would be a mamzeres, if it's a girl. So if she marries a Yisrael, she's not allowed to marry a Yisrael. A mamzeres is not allowed to marry a regular Jew. If she does, it takes effect, but it's forbidden. Same thing for a Nesina. Nesina is a descendant of the nation of Givon. They had this complicated conversion as a nation, and ultimately they're not allowed to marry regular Jews, and if they do, it still takes effect. So the Mishnah is telling us that the status of the child will follow the disqualified parent. So if If it's a mamzeres marrying a Yisrael, the child will be a mamzer or a mamzeres. If it's a boy, a mamzer. If it's a girl, a mamzeres. If it's a nesina that marry a Yisrael, so then the child will have that status of nasin, of being a descendant of that nation and forbidden to marry other Jews. Or the opposite, bas Yisrael a mamzer l'nasin. If you have a Jewish girl, a Jewish woman who marries a mamzer or a nasin, if the man is a mamzer, he's Jewish, but he's a mamzer, he's the product of a forbidden relationship, and he is not allowed to marry a regular Jewish girl. But if he does, so then the child, our Mishnah is telling us, takes on the status of the disqualified parent. In this case, that's the man who was a mamzer, and the same thing if the man is a nasin, he's this from this nation, a descendant of this nation Givon, and he marries a regular Jew, which he's not allowed to, the child will have that status. So that's our second rule, that basically, again, the first rule was if there is Kiddushin and it's permitted, then the child follows the father. If there is Kiddushin but it was prohibited, then the child follows whoever was the sort of disqualified parent. And then we have the Kol Mi She'en La Olav Kiddushin, Aval Yesh La Al Acherim Kiddushin Avlad Mamzer. In order for the child to be a mamzer, it has to be a situation where Kiddushin won't take effect on this woman, but she is Jewish, and so she could have Kiddushin in a different situation. So let's say, for example, a man tries to betroth his sister. Kiddushin does not take effect. Their child would be a mamzer, or I guess back one step, because she could have Kiddushin from somebody else. She's a regular Jewish girl, so therefore the rule is that's a woman whose child from a forbidden union would be a mamzer, as opposed to, first there's ve'ezazeh. What would be example of this? This is when there's a relationship. A man has a union with a woman and it's an example of arayos, of a forbidden relationship. So then the child is a mamzer. But any woman who not only does Kiddushin not take effect on him because they're related or something like that, but it wouldn't take effect from anyone else because she's not Jewish, or she's a shifcha, she's a maidservant, as we're about to see, which is another not fully Jewish. So then there's no Kiddushin, so then the child would not be a mamzer. Avad kamosa, the child will be like her. And what is an example of that? Vlad shifcha v'nachris, that will be the child of a maidservant or of a non-Jew. So if she is not Jewish, and then even if it would be an example of one of these forbidden relationships, or it would look like one of those forbidden relationships, the child still wouldn't be a mamzer, because she falls into this category. Not only does she not have Kiddushin from this man, she doesn't have Kiddushin from anybody because she's not Jewish. So the product of such a union would not be a mamzer. Okay. Where that might be relevant is if that child would convert, then it wouldn't be a mamzer because they're not. Okay, so the first half of the Mishnah gives us two rules. One rule is wherever you have Kiddushin and there's no transgression, meaning it's a permitted Kiddushin, the child will follow the status of the father. And then the second rule was wherever you have a Kiddushin that takes effect, but it was a prohibited union, but one that Kiddushin still takes effect, which there's limited cases where that's true. But in a situation like that, the child follows the pugum, takes on the status of whichever parent was sort of the disqualified one, the mamzer or the mamzeres, or in the case where it was a forbidden relationship with a Kohen, meaning the child will not have the elevated status of a Kohen, but rather would be a halal, would be a disqualified Kohen. Okay, says the Gemara, Kol makom sheyesh kiddushin. It's really challenging. First is just a quote. We said the first rule was wherever there's Kiddushin and no transgression, the child follows the father. Amar le Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Yochanan, Kulalahu. Is this a rule? Is this a rule? By the way, usually when we say Rabbi Shimon, we mean Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a Tana and wouldn't have been talking to Rabbi Yochanan. They suggest that maybe this Rabbi Shimon, it means Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish, who talked a lot with Rabbi Yochanan. So anyways, this Rabbi Shimon said to Rabbi Yochanan, Kulalahu dekol magum sheish kiddushin en avera haglad holich achar azachar. Is it really a rule that wherever there's kiddushin and there's no avera, meaning it's a permitted kiddushin, the child will follow the father's status? Hare. But what about the following case? Ger, top of the next page, Ger shenasa mamzeres. If a convert marries a mamzeres. So as we're about to see, there is a dispute whether, we know that a mamzeres, a mamzeres is the product of an illegal union, and she's not allowed to marry a regular Jew. Is she allowed to marry a convert? So that's a machlokas, that's a dispute, and we're now quoting the opinion that holds yes, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi holds that ger shnasa mamzeres is permitted, and yet Diyesh Kiddushin ve'en avera. So that's an example of where there's Kiddushin and there's no avera. It's permitted according to Rabbi Yossi for a convert to marry a mamzeres. And yet have vlad holif achar hapagum. But yet Rabbi Yossi agrees that the status of their child is still a mamzer. We go by the pagum. We go by the disqualified one. We don't go by the father necessarily. Says Reish Lakish, isn't that an example? Doesn't that defy our rule? Our rule was that as long as it's a prohibited marriage, opposite. As long as it's permitted marriage, the child will follow the father. But this, according to Rabbi Yossi, is permitted. It's permitted for a convert to marry a mamzeres, and yet he holds that the child is still a mamzer. Follows the pagum, follows the disqualified one. Titania, as we learn in a brisa, maybe disqualified isn't the best word. Pagum is more damaged. There's some they have a diminished status. So the Tanya, as we learn in a brisa, ger shenasa mamzeres havlad mamzer divrei Rabbi Yossi. If a convert marries a mamzeres, the child is a mamzer, follows the status of the pagum, of the diminished status. Divrei Rabbi Yossi, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Even though Rabbi Yossi holds it's permitted, the child does not follow the father. Doesn't that defy our rule that if it's permitted, the child will take on the status of the father? That was Reish Lakish's question to Rabbi Yochanan. Amar le, so Rabbi Yochanan responded, Mi savras masnising Rabbi Yossi. Do you think that our Mishnah is in accordance with Rabbi Yossi, that Rabbi Yossi is the author in our Mishnah? Masnising Rabbi Yehuda, the Mishnah is going like the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, de Amar, who says, Ger lo yisa mamzeres. He holds that a convert is not allowed to marry a mamzeres. V'yesh kiddushin v'yesh avera. And it's true, kiddushin takes effect, but it's an avera, and avlad holech achar hapagum. And the vlad, the product of the marriage, follows the pagum, follows the disqualified one, the diminished status, and takes on the status of mamzer. So the Mishnah, so everything's consistent. Our Mishnah is like the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that a convert is not allowed to marry a mamzeres, like any other Jew is not allowed to marry a mamzeres. Any other regular Jew, a mamzer, can marry a mamzeres, but not a regular Jew. So a convert is the same. Therefore, they're not allowed to marry. If they do, it takes effect, but they're not allowed to marry. And that category, our rule is if you have a prohibited, if you have a kiddushin, but it's prohibited, so then the status of the child is like the pagum, the one who's disqualified, the one who's diminished status. So, and that's the case here. The child is a mamzer. Ask the Gemara v'nisnaya. I have listed that example. We listed a few examples of situations where you have a prohibited marriage, but kiddushin takes effect. We mentioned divorcee marrying a Kohen, a widow marrying a Kohen Gadol, a mamzer marrying a Jew, a regular Jew. So he says, why don't we list also a mamzer or a mamzeres marrying a convert? So it says, and I guess in particular because it's subject to debate, so he should have mentioned it. So the Gemara says, no, Tana kol makom deseifa le'isuye. No, we said kol makom, every case. We gave a rule, and the general rule comes to include other cases. So it is included. We don't have to list every case. By saying a generalization, every situation, that was how we stated our rule. Any place where there's Kiddushin and there's a prohibition, the child follows the disqualified one. What's this any case? We're about to list the cases. Why do you have to say any case? Because there's other cases, and this is an example of another case, the case where a ger, a convert, marries a mamzeres. It's another example of a forbidding marriage where Kiddushin takes effect, and the child takes on the disqualified status. In this case, would be a mamzer, or mamzeres. B'bayisema, says the Gemara, or alternatively you could say, Liolam Rabbi Yossi. Really, we could say our Mishnah agrees with Rabbi Yossi. And really, our Mishnah could hold that there's a case where it's a permitted marriage, because according to Rabbi Yossi, the convert is allowed to marry a mamzeres. You can have a permitted marriage where the child does not follow the father. Vitana ezozum lemute. And it says, and what are the examples? As an exclusion. In other words, what the Gemara is suggesting is when we laid out the rule in the Mishnah that anywhere, kol makom sheish kiddushin, vein avera, haglad holich achar hazachar, anywhere where you have kiddushin in a permitted way, the child would follow the father. It sounds like it's making a rule, but then it gives specific examples. Ve'izozu, what are the cases? So that, says the Gemara, is coming to exclude other cases. It's really not a general rule. By saying, Ezu, what are the cases? So we're naming the cases. To the exclusion of other cases, meaning there really are exceptions to this. So it could be that the Mishnah is in accordance with Rabbi Yossi, and really there are exceptions. And this is one of the exceptions. The exception is that by saying, Ezozu, what are the cases where this applies? This applies when a Yisrael marries a Levi, a Leviah, right? Any permitted marriage, but there's an exception. A ger, a convert that marries mamzeres, even though that's permitted, the product does not follow, the child does not follow the father, it follows the pogrom, it follows the disqualified one. So, fine. So 1 second though. Says the Gemara, if the ezozu, if we're giving the specifics, then we're giving the specifics. We're telling you what the cases are, and everything else is excluded. So ask the Gemara, ve'ezozu v'sulo. These are the cases, and there's no more. V'harei chalal shenasa bas Yisrael. What about a chalal? Chalal is a disqualified Kohen. Let's say the son of a Kohen who married a divorcee. Their son is a chalal, and if he marries a bas Yisrael, he marries a regular Jewish girl, which is permitted. There's Kiddushin there, and there's no Avera. Havlad holich achar hazachar. The child follows the father in that case. And in that case, the father is the halal. So if we're giving the examples, if apparently we're suggesting when we say Ezozu, what are the cases? We're giving all the cases. So, ask the Gemara, but we missed one. There is another case where we have a permitted marriage, and the child follows the father. So, and that is the Chalal. Chalal marries a Yisraelis, a regular Jewish girl. So this is disqualified. Kohen marries a regular Jewish girl. It's permitted, totally permitted. The child follows the father. The child is a Chalal too. That should be part of the list. Says the Gemara, Halo Kashya, that's not a question. Kribdostai ben Rabbi Yehuda Svirale. Our Mishnah holds like Rabbi Dostai ben Rabbi Yehuda, who we had in an earlier Gemara, just a few pages ago. And he holds that this concept that a Jewish girl marrying a halal, she's like a mikvah taira. She purifies the offspring. And actually, he holds that the child is not a halal. So a halal, a disqualified Kohen, marries a regular Jewish woman. If he would marry a halala, a woman who's also the product of a forbidden marriage, then the child would continue in that status, I believe. But since he's marrying a regular Israelis, so Rabbi Dostai holds that the child is not a halal anymore. And so this actually is an exception. We have a permitted marriage. We have a permitted marriage where the father's a halal, the mother's a Israelis, they're allowed to get married, and the child does not follow the status of the father. So this is another exception, which fits into what we're doing right now, because we're suggesting now that it said, when it said Eizozu, what are the cases? It was giving all the cases. So this would be an exception, and that's fine. Ask the Gemara, but I have another problem. V'harei Yisrael shenasa chalala. What about Yisrael? This time it's the man is a regular Yisrael. The woman is a halala. She is from a Kohen who had a forbidden union with a divorcee or something. She's a halala. As a halala, she's not allowed to marry a Kohen. But she can marry Yisrael. Diyesh Kiddushin, ve'en avera. There's Kiddushin, there's no avera. Havlad holech achar hazacher. In that case, everybody agrees that the child there follows the father. So we have a Yisrael who marries a halala. If they would have a girl, the girl would be allowed to marry a Kohen. Right? This woman, the mother, she's a halala, she can't marry a Kohen. But if she marries a Yisrael, which is permitted, the child, the daughter, if they have a daughter, she's allowed to marry a Kohen, which means she's taking the status of the father, not of the mother. So that's another example where we have a permitted marriage and the child follows the father. So why is that not listed? If Eizozu, if when we say what are the cases, we're very specific in listing all the cases, this one should be listed too. Says the Gemara, Tana kol makom dereisha lasuye. This was included when we said kol makom. We said every case. Why did we say every case? Especially if it wasn't true. Because we were saying there's exceptions. But what was the generalization coming to include then? It must be coming to include additional cases. This is an additional case that was being included in the words kol makom, every situation. Or any situation, which again was lav davka, didn't really mean it, but it was coming to include additional cases. This is why in the additional cases it was coming to include. This is another case where it's a permitted marriage and the child follows the father, and that is a Yisrael, Jewish man, regular Jewish man, marries a halala. She's the product of a forbidden marriage between a Kohen and a divorcee. She's not allowed to marry a Kohen, but if she marries a Yisrael, their daughter is allowed to marry a Kohen. That's the daughter following the status of the father. Even though that's another example, it's not mentioned, but it's included in kol makom, any case. Ask the Gemara v'nisnaya behedya. Well, why doesn't it just say it? Why does it have to be included in kol makom? Just say it explicitly. Says the Gemara, mishum delo masni la. Because it couldn't say it smoothly. Because the way the Mishnah was set up, it would have had to introduce a whole new case. And it didn't want to do that. If it could have just assumed it into the list, absorbed it into the list, then it would have mentioned it. But to mention it as a whole new case, it didn't want to do. Why could it not have just absorbed it into the list? He says, hey Finisni, what would it have said? Because what's the list that we have? What is the list the Mishnah gives of the permitted marriages? It says like a Kohen and a Levi and Yisrael. So he says, how would we have said it? Kohenes, we would say a Kohenes, the daughter of a Kohen. Vilevia, the daughter of a Levi. B'Yisraelis, the daughter of Yisrael. V'chalala, and because we're trying to get this other case, we have to throw into the list a halala, the daughter of a forbidden marriage of a Kohen. Shenises l'Kohen Levi v'Yisrael, who marry, and this is how the Mishnah went on, who marry a Kohen, a Levi, and a Yisrael, those are all examples of permitted marriages. But that's not true. It couldn't have said that. V'chalala l'kohen michazir, because is a chalala allowed to marry a Kohen? She's not. So it couldn't have included it in that list. The list was a Kohen is, we're listing permitted marriages. So we say a Kohenes, a Levia, a Yisraelis, who marry a Kohen, a Levi, or a Yisrael. Those are all examples of permitted marriages, and the child follows the father. Now, if we had tried to add Chalala to the list, we have a problem. Because you can't say that. They're not examples of permitted marriages anymore. Because a Chalala is not allowed to marry a Kohen. So we couldn't have just thrown her onto the list. So we would have had to make a new list. That we didn't want to do. That's why it doesn't mention it explicitly in the list, and it's just absorbed. It's included in Kol Makom. We have an example. It's true. There's an additional case that's permitted. A Chalala marrying a Yisrael, the daughter would follow the father, but didn't want to say explicitly. It's included in the general rule that we stated. Ask the Gemara, V'ha'ika de Rabba bar bar Chana. But there's still something missing from the Mishnah, where we have a permitted Kiddushin, no Aveira, and the child follows the father, which is the teaching of Rabba bar bar Chana. Dama Rabba bar bar Chana, Rabbi Yochanan, Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Mitzris Rishona. So the halacha is that a Mitzri, an Egyptian convert, is not allowed to marry a regular Jew until the third generation. They can only marry other Egyptian converts until the third generation. So, So what happens if you have a second generation Mitzri, a second generation male Egyptian convert, and he marries a first generation Mitzris? Now, the second generation Mitzri, his child will be a third generation Mitzri convert and should be allowed to marry in. But the woman is a first generation, so her child is only a second generation one and can't marry regular Jews yet. So how do we look at the child? Are they a third generation Mitzri convert, Egyptian convert, or a second generation Mitzri convert? So Rabbi bar Chana saying in Rabbi Yochanan, Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Mitzris Rishona, if you have a second generation male Egyptian convert who marries a first generation female Egyptian convert, Bina Shlishi Have, the child is considered the third generation. So that's another example. That means we're considering that child to be the product of the father. We're going after the father. So that's another example of a permitted marriage. They're allowed to marry. First generation Mitzris, female Mitzri convert, is allowed to marry a second generation male Egyptian convert, and we're saying the child follows the father and is considered third generation. So why is that not listed in the Mishnah? So again, the Gemara says, Tana kol makom dereisha v'asuye. We include in the general rule, again, when it said kol makom, any case, this is included in that general rule. It didn't say it explicitly, but it included it in that. Ask the Gemara, that's good according to Rabba bar bar Chana. But Ular Rav Dimi da'amar sheni have. But according to Rav Dimi, who says that actually no, in this case the child follows the mother. We consider the child to be a second generation. So we have a different problem. This is breaking the rule. Then this is breaking the rule, because here we have a permitted marriage, and according to Rav Dimi, the child is the mother's child, so to speak, is going by the mother and is only considered second generation, and not going by the father. If it was going by the father, we would consider the child third generation. But Rav Dimi says no, we consider it second generation. So it's not following the rule. So that's a problem. So says the Gemara, Tana ezozu mimu'ute. Don't worry, says the Gemara, we have the words ezozu. Which one is it to exclude it? In other words, like we said earlier, there's when the Mishnah says specific examples, it's to the exclusion of other cases. Really what we're saying is it's not true all the time. Here are the specific examples. There may be even other examples that are included by the words kol makom, any case, but in no way is this going to always be true, and so it's okay that there's exceptions. Ask the Gemara b'ha'ika, but we still have another question, and now we're turning to the second let's see. We have another case that's going to present a problem. The other case is v'ha'ika diki asa Ravin amar Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, be'umos halech achar hazachar. When it comes to the nations of the world, you go by the male. In other words, it's if let's say two nations marry, it's important to know what nation they are, because they have different halachos. If they're from Mitzrayim, they're from Egypt, or they're Ammonites, right? Ammonites are never allowed to marry. The males are never allowed to marry. The females are allowed to marry right away. The Egyptians, both the males and the females, can't marry until the third generation. So it makes a difference what nation they're from. So what happens if two nations marry? How do we determine what nation the child is? So it says, we go by the zachar. We go by the male. But niskairu, so then, if they convert, halech achar hapagam shebishneim, then we'll go by the disqualified one of each of them. In other words, if they have a child when they're not Jewish, before they convert, so then the child follows the father. Wherever the father is, that's what the child is. But if the parents first convert, and then they have a child, so then the child takes on whichever is the more stringent status. In other words, if it might depend if it's a boy or a girl child. For a boy, let's say the parents were, we had the example of the father was from Ammon, and the mother was a Mitzri. So for a man, it's more stringent to be from Ammon. You can never marry in if you're an Ammonite convert. For a woman, an Ammonite convert is allowed to marry, but a Mitzri convert can't marry until the third generation, so it's more stringent to be a Mitzri. So Rabbi Yochanan says we follow whichever one is more strict, is more pagum. So if it was a girl, we'd say, we treat her like an Egyptian convert. If it was a boy, we would go the more stringent route, and we'd treat him like a Ammonite convert. Again, this is when if the parents are each one of those types of converts, and the child is born after they convert. Now, here, this is another example of a permitted marriage where we're saying to go by the pagum. So it's another exception to the rule. They were allowed to marry, but yet we're saying the child doesn't take on the father's status. The child takes on the more pagum, whichever one is a more diminished. So again, we say Tana Ezozu Limute. We have the Ezozu. What are they? We have the specific examples, and that excludes the exceptions. You're right, there's an exception. Ask the Gemara, Hi Mai. It says, hold on a second. If we say that the Mishnah goes like Rabbi Yehuda, going back to where we started, we began, or one of the first things we discussed was a machlokas, a dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, as to whether a ger, a convert, is allowed to marry a mamzeres. We said everybody agrees the child will be a mamzer or a mamzeres, but is a convert allowed to marry a mamzeres in the first place? Rabbi Yossi said yes, and despite that the child is still a mamzer, and Rabbi Yehuda said no. So it says the Gemara, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Mishnah fits. Because we'd say as follows, we would say, Kol makom dereisha, in the Reisha, in the first part of the Mishnah, when it says Kol makom, any case, what was that? Then we said that's coming to include something. What's it coming to include? Vasuye Yisrael shenasa chalala. We said that could be coming to include if a Yisrael marries a chalala. If a regular Jewish man marries a chalala, we said that even though she wasn't allowed to marry a Kohen, since it's a permitted marriage, the child, if they have a daughter, she is allowed to marry a Kohen, which means she's not following her mother's status, she's following her father's status. It's an example of a permitted marriage where you follow the father's status that's not listed in the Mishnah, but it's the kol makom comes to include it. When we say in any case, that comes to include that case. U'de Rabba bar bar Chana. And it also could come to include the rule of Rabba bar bar Chana, which was that Rabba bar bar Chana held, if a second generation Egyptian convert marries a first generation one, the child follows the father. It's a permitted marriage. The child follows the father, and the child is a third generation Egyptian convert. So that would be what the kol makom is coming to include. And ezozu, and what's the ezozu when we say this specific case, limute de Rav Dimi? It could be coming to exclude Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi argued on that point. Rav Dimi held that no, if a second generation Egyptian marries a first generation Egyptian convert, the child follows the lesser one and is only a second generation one. She doesn't follow the father. It's an exception to the rule, but exceptions are okay because ezozu, when it says specifics, that was coming to exclude the exceptions. V'Ravin, and then we also had the rule that we just said from Ravin, that when if you have two converts from different nations that marry, even though it's a permitted marriage, their child follows the pagum, will take on whichever is the more disqualified status, the more diminished status. That's what ezozu will be coming to exclude. And then continues at the top of the next page, kol makom de seifa. And in the Seifa, in the second half of the Mishnah, which we haven't talked about in a while, but the second half of the Mishnah said that if you have a Kiddushin that takes effect, but it's a forbidden marriage, so then the child follows the pagum, the child follows the disqualified one, the diminished status. That would be lasuya ger shenas mamzeres. That would be to include, the case of where a convert marries a mamzeres. If a convert marries a mamzeres, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's forbidden. And the child follows the pagum. The child is a mamzer. And that could be in the second half of the Mishnah when it says, in any case, what's it coming to include? It's coming to include that case. That's another example that wasn't mentioned where you have a case of a Kiddushin taking effect on a forbidden marriage and the child follows the pagum. But if this Mishnah is in accordance with Rabbi Yossi, which the Gemara suggested at one point, we could still explain the first clause of the Mishnah like we explained. And ezozu kedamar, and in the first half of the Mishnah we could explain the kol makom, all the cases, is coming to include the examples that we just gave, and the ezozu, and what are the specific ones, which is an exclusion, that there's exclusions. Those will exclude the cases we mentioned just before. But when we come to the second half of the Mishnah, ela kol makom de seifa lasuye mai. This is where we're going to run into a problem. When it says kol makom in the Seifa, when it says any case in the second half of the Mishnah, what is that coming to include? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, it was coming to include a convert who marries a mamzeres. They're not allowed to marry, and the child is a mamzer, follows the pagum, it follows our rule, and the kol makom could be coming to include that. But according to Rabbi Yossi, they were allowed to marry. So that's not an example of a prohibiting marriage. It's not an additional example. We don't have any additional example. So of a prohibiting marriage where the Kiddushin takes effect and the child, it follows the pagum, follows the one of diminished status. We don't have another example. Only the ones that are listed. And if that's the case, then what's the kol makom coming to teach me? Why does it say in any case? It seems necessary to be able to explain that, to fit everything in the Mishnah together. What's the kol makom coming to include? Says the Gemara, it's a good question, but even according to your thinking, you still have a problem. Because, Rabbi Yehuda, even if it was going according to Rabbi Yehuda, ezozu de seifa lamali. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we also have the same kind of question. In the second half of the Mishnah, it says ezozu, it says examples. Now examples, we said, when it gives specific example, it's coming to exclude certain exceptions. Well, what are the exceptions to the second rule of the Mishnah according to Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda, where do you have an exception to the rule that if you have a forbidding marriage where Kiddushin takes effect, the child follows the pugum. You don't have an exception. So what are you going to say? So Ella, Idi Tara Reisha Ezozu, Tara Seifa Ezozu. So what you'll say is as follows. The first half of the Mishnah, everything's fine. We explained the Kol Makom, it's coming to include extra things. We explained the Ezozu, when it gave specifics, it's coming to exclude. You come to the second part of the Mishnah, and you can't explain those, well, it's a style thing, you'll say. Once it used those terms in the first half, where it was including and excluding things, so it kept using those same types of terminology. That's what you'll have to say for Rabbi Yehuda to explain the Ezozu in the second half of the Mishnah. So Hachanami, so here too we'll say the same thing for Rabbi Yossi. You want to know why it says Kol Makom. In any case, in the second half of the Mishnah, when there is no additional cases, what's it coming to include? Nothing. But Idi de Tara Reisha Kol Makom Taranami Seifa Kol Makom. But it was a style thing. Once it said it in the first half of the Mishnah, where it was coming to include extra cases. So then it said Kol Makom, any case, in the second half of the Mishnah, even though it doesn't come to actually include any additional cases. Okay, we'll hold here.